In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth. And the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. The Old Testament recounts many amazing stories. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, and David fighting against Goliath. But beyond popular myth, is there any historic proof to support these stories? Is the Old Testament merely a collection of whimsical legends, or on the contrary, was it inspired by factual events, events recreated to match the religious faith of its readers?
They wanted to tell the story of the origins of time. They knew that Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldeans, to the south, so they used a bit of the history of the world that they knew. And the part of the world that they knew the best was Mesopotamia and northern Syria. That was their universe, more or less.
The Great Flood is one of the most extraordinary and fabulous stories in the Old Testament. This adventure featuring Noah and his menagerie of creatures fascinates children. And they aren't the only ones.
Noah is one of the Bible's oldest patriarchs. And when God decided to wipe out humanity, who was displeasing him, he set down the Great Flood, but he chose Noah to save those who were to remain, along with his family, to start over from scratch. And of course, he took animals on his ark, one male and one female of each species. It's a wonder that Noah could tell the difference between a male mosquito and a female one, but hey, let's skip over those pesky details and focus on the story. Noah saved humanity when God decided to clear the face of the earth.
But why does the Bible speak of an ark?
In the Bible, it was the word teba, which had two meanings. It could be a box or a boat, something along those lines. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek in the 3rd century, referred to as a Septuagint Bible, this word was translated as arka, which meant boat that floats, hence the word ark.
Since the invention of so-called rational science, many researchers have been delving into the authenticity of this story. Did Noah and his ark actually exist? Was there really a great flood?
Like so many other wonderful myths and legends, the scientific proof of Noah's Ark, of its resting place, of any other great artifact from history tends to be rather thin on the ground. We can suggest from what we find in the geological strata that there were a number of devastating floods, and from that we may deduce that somebody, whether it was Noah or Utnapishtim of the other chronicles, actually built a boat and survived with his family and his livestock.
Over the past few decades, a handful of scientists have attempted to find traces of this global disaster. Based on geological clues, they finally came to the conclusion that the Bible story was nothing more than an allegory of good and evil. While the world's top scholars were exploring the depths of the ocean, other adventurers were headed for Turkey.
There have been many expeditions, some of them by people with rather more money than sense and a deep religious urgency to prove that the Old Testament account of the flood is true, who have searched the mountains all around Ararat. And if we just pop a search engine onto the internet, we will find 1, 10, 50 accounts of such expeditions, and the most any of them ever seem to have found a few pieces of mysterious wood, and they never even managed to bring it back to have it radiocarbon dated. That would have been the right thing to do with it. So that, yes, there have been many attempts to find the Ark, but nothing has ever been conclusively proved. If it's anywhere, and we follow the biblical narrative, then it's on the Turkish-Iranian border where stands Mount Ararat.
Can you recognize anything here? What can you recognize? Just go back over there a little bit so he can see with the picture here with the camera. What is this here?
This is the Noah's Ark.
Noah's Ark. And this is Mount Ararat. Here, the next one.
We will be there in 2 days.
Mount Ararat?
Yeah.
That's Mount Ararat. And then all the churches in Armenia are designed like the shape of Mount Ararat.
Yeah, tomorrow when we will leave the Jerusalem, we'll go to Istanbul, and from Istanbul we are going to Mount Ararat.
Intrigued by these questions, I hopped on a flight to Turkey, home of the Ottoman Empire. The name Ararat Mountains used to designate a massive mountain range between Turkey and Armenia. Nowadays, due to current borders, it is difficult to calculate the exact size of this mountain range. Whatever it may be, I need to start somewhere. So why not start with the highest point in the region, Mount Ararat? The history of this mountain is actually quite interesting.
Ararat itself has numerous little outcrops of stone, which, if you're flying over in indeterminate visibility, you could say to your co-pilot, "Hey Jack, there's Noah's Ark." And by the time you've landed the plane and walked back to find it, it looks totally different from the other side of the mountain.
For quite some time, strange rumors have been circulating that below the permanent ice of Ararat lie the vestiges of a long wooden vessel, which some believe to be the legendary Noah's Ark.
Yes, on Mount Ararat. Research was done in that area of the world. It seems that they found traces left by a boat, which might date back to about the time of the Great Flood.
As early as antiquity in the Middle Ages, writers told of the presence of the Ark on a mountain in Armenia. Italian explorer Marco Polo also claimed that Noah's Ark was located on the top of Mount Ararat. These rumors were reinforced by a series of incidents that took place in the latter half of the 19th century. According to the story told in Genesis, after being adrift for months, Noah's Ark finally hit land on the Ararat Mountains.
In the Bible, it says the mountains of Ararat. And mountains, if there is, you put S, it means the whole area. It doesn't mean a mountain, only one mountain. The Ararat is one mountain. It's a sign, what I believe, it's a sign of the area. All these mountains are connected to Ararat. And I say it is, if there is an ark, we should look somewhere around this mountain, not in the glacier.
On May 2nd, 1883, the entire region around Mount Ararat was shaken by a violent earthquake. Entire villages were destroyed, buried under heaps of rock and ice. In the aftermath, Turkish authorities sent a group of experts to the area. While climbing Mount Ararat, the members of the Turkish Commission discovered a large wooden structure that looked like a boat, the edge of which was protruding a foot out of a glacier.
And that's when, given the structure of the boat, which appeared to be very old, there were indications that this was the landing place of Noah's Ark.
The men managed to slip through an opening and get inside the boat. Apparently, there were 3 large compartments inside, and the rest of the space was filled with solid ice. Was it the legendary Noah's Ark? In 1887, a man named John Joseph also claimed that he had found Noah's Ark. The explorer was heading a team that was trying to trace back the sources of the Euphrates River. The Ark was almost entirely visible. Only a section in the middle was still covered with snow. In 1908 and 1910, during 2 particularly hot summers, a young local sheep herder, Georges Agopian, traveled with his grandfather to where the Ark was. According to Agopian, it was the warm weather that had freed it up from its icy grip. The entire roof of the vessel was covered with a cornice pierced with several small holes. In August 1916, while on a reconnaissance flight in eastern Turkey, a pilot in the Russian army, Vladimir Roskovitsky, observed the bow of a large boat sticking out of a glacier. Supposedly, Russian soldiers not only located the Ark, they also took photographs of it. Unfortunately, these photos, if they ever did exist, disappeared in the chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution. In June 1949, an American Army U-2 spy plane photographed a curious dark patch at the top of Mount Ararat. These photos, labeled as the Ararat Anomaly, were not released until the 1970s. It turns out that the anomaly was apparently nothing more than a rock formation.
There's this wonderful rock formation just a little way away from Ararat, and the theory that goes with it is that the whole of the Ark has been petrified, that it has somehow been turned into stone. Now, let's just think for a moment about all the folklore that we have ever read that sets out to explain things by saying, oh, what we can see here in the landscape is something that's turned to stone.
In the summer of 1959, a NATO cartographer, Captain Ilan Durupinar, was tasked with taking aerial photographs of a region slightly south of Mount Ararat. During the flight, Durupinar photographed a surprising rock formation that was shaped like a long boat. The following year, the photo appeared in Life magazine with the caption, Noah's Ark. The odd rocky formation, nicknamed Durupinar's Ark in memory of the cartographer, was the subject of several studies. It is located about 15 kilometers from the township of Dogubayazit, which has a population of less than 60,000. Dogubayazit is 15 kilometers southwest of Mount Ararat. All expeditions in search of Noah's Ark must pass through Dogubayazit. Over the past few years, these expeditions have all had one common denominator. Ararat Trek, a small local company offering extreme adventures, including climbing Mount Ararat. Once I arrived in Dogubayazit, I immediately headed for Ararat Trek, where I spoke with its owner, Zephyr Onai. Zephyr is a native of Dogubayazit. He is now a local figure. He runs several businesses in the region. He speaks 5 languages and has contacts throughout the country. He doubles as both guide and translator, or even cab driver if need be. He has led several teams to the top of Mount Ararat, a good half dozen of which were in search of Noah's Ark. For anyone thinking of embarking on this adventure, Zephyronai is the man to see.
This mountain, the Ararat, we are having permit even if we have the sportive activities in the mountain. Like just go to the sportive activity to walk, to trek up to the summit. We need to have a special paper from the government authorities 45 days before our trips.
As the first step on my path to Noah's Ark, I chose to stop at the mysterious rock formation at the Durupinar site. To get there, you must travel across wild terrain, almost lunar in its desolation. Here, away from civilization, there's nothing but desert. The people live here exactly like their ancestors did. They live in small stone houses, and each day the men take their sheep out to the pastures. For the most part, sheep farming is the livelihood of these communities. Five kilometers from Dogubayazit, we make our first stop at the Ishak Pasha Palace. Built on a natural headland, this remarkable structure, now abandoned, was constructed between 1685 and 1784. It was once a pit stop for caravans traveling on the Silk Trade Route. It served as a fortress, a prison, and a business center. In the surrounding mountains, you can still see the vestiges of buildings and fences, ruins that show how important this area was in the 18th century. We're back on the road again. The terrain is both hostile and magnificent. Behind us lies the imposing Mount Ararat with its snow-covered peak. And just beside it is Little Ararat, a secondary peak with a height of 1,200 meters. To the west, we can make out the massive peaks of Armenia, known as the Ararat Mountains, to coin the phrase used in Genesis. Here, the average altitude is 1,600 meters. How many meters of water would it have taken to submerge this entire region? If there had been a great flood, wouldn't there be traces of it? Did the flood described in the Bible actually happen?
Surely there must have been a reason for such destruction. That's where the myths, the legends come in. According to one myth, there was a man named Utnapishtim who lived with his wife and children, and he was warned by a god that there's going to be a really horrendous flood and you need to save yourself. This legend dates back to the Sumerian era, which lasted from the end of the 3rd to the beginning of the 1st millennium before Jesus Christ. His story is very similar to the story of Noah found in Genesis. So Utnapishtim built a boat and loaded it with a male and female of each animal, plus his wife and children. They escaped death, but everything around them was completely destroyed. The reason given for the destruction was that the gods could no longer sleep because humans were making too much racket.
In chapter 6 of Genesis, God regrets having made man. He decides to destroy all living beings, man and beast, and the fowls of the air, in a great flood. However, he makes an exception for Noah, an honest and fair man, who has found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He's instructed by God to build a boat where he and his family will be safe from the storm.
And that's when life began again, with Noah, his wife, and their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The names are quite interesting. Shem is the ancestor of the Semites, the people from the area we now refer to as the Middle East. Hebrew, Babylonian, and Syrian are Semitic languages. Then there was Ham. People tend to say Cam, but it should be pronounced Ham, which means black in the sense of a root race. That corresponds to the people of Africa in Hebrew. They must have known that there were black people living in Africa. They must have had some interaction with those people. And Japhet, or Japhet, is a name that corresponds to Asia Minor, particularly Greece. Japheth is one of the names that was used in Hebrew to designate Greece, which we could consider to be Europe. So the names corresponded to the world that they knew. It was truly an obliteration of humanity, and it was repaired afterwards. And the three sons, they were like the seeds of the world that they had known beyond the Middle East. There was an African part and a European part that were starting over.
God also instructed Noah to take a male and female of each species with him on the ark. Once the ark was completed and Noah and his menagerie were safely on board, God opened the floodgates, and water soon covered the entire surface of the earth. At least, that's what the Bible says. But is the Bible story based on real events?
A lot of the Bible story was plagiarized, if we could use that term, copying ancient stories written by the Babylonians, the Assyro-Babylonians. There is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is exactly the same as Noah's. So the story of Noah's Ark was strongly based on the story of Gilgamesh.
Mesopotamian documents have disappeared completely. They were discovered during an archaeological dig. For 2,000 years, we knew absolutely nothing about this story. So it was a recent discovery, and it ended up being just like the story in Genesis. Clearly, the Hebrew Genesis is inspired by the Mesopotamian story of older civilization. This old culture and legend, we'll call it a legend, dates back to at least the oldest texts written by the Mesopotamians were in the 3rd millennium before Jesus Christ.
This story of a natural disaster from which only a single family escapes only to repopulate the earth is not exclusive to the book of Genesis. It is a story that is found in the midst of several civilizations. A legend held by the Squamish tribes of the northwest coast of North America tells of a large canoe that escaped a great flood and landed on Mount Baker.
There are stories of great floods in all religions of the world. And I'm not just making that up. They're everywhere. What lies behind all these stories? Personally, I think that there are common experiences in all pockets of humanity. In the face of natural disasters, in the face of major natural phenomena that don't necessarily carry the same weight as the documents that will describe them after the fact, turning them into absolutely extraordinary, fabulous tales. But if we try to place it in the context of a city, just think what it would be like for us. There's a flood somewhere in the world. We're intelligent enough to know what a flood is. We have solid houses and buildings, etc. Now try to imagine what it was like back then. You're living in a village on the banks of the Tigris or the Euphrates, and you see the water level rise exceptionally high. Floods do happen, and the village is completely swept away because the houses are made of brick. It's the total destruction of the world as you know it. From that starting point, you can easily construct something that includes the entire planet. Again, we can't look at it from a modern perspective. The text basically said that the entire world was destroyed by the floodwaters.
Does the universality of this myth mean that it represents a collective memory of a global disaster in Earth's history, or does it represent an archetype of the story of origin?
The story of the Great Flood, which the Bible centralizes around Noah, is really widespread throughout the Middle East and the area around it, the Chaldean hills, and of course Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. Now, as we know from tragedies of recent storms and hurricanes and tsunamis, there can be immense water power that brings with it tragedy and death and destruction. So I certainly think that the story we have in the Bible refers to group memory, folk memory, of some such deluge.
For most scientists, this story of Noah and his ark and the global flood is nothing more than a fabulous tale. A legend that was not based on a worldwide deluge, but rather a series of smaller local floods. If the story told in the book of Genesis were taken literally, it would be highly unlikely. In chapter 6, verse 15, God gives Noah specific instructions as to the size of the ark. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits.
In chapter 6, verse 15, God gives Noah specific instructions as to the size of the ark. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. So what was built? Clearly, as I explained earlier, when we discussed the word teba, he built an ark, translated into Greek as arka, a structure that should look like a huge box that could float. It was 300 cubits long. A cubit you bend your wrist, like that. Then you measure from your wrist to your elbow. It's about 1.5 feet. The length may vary. It's not that precise. That's about how long it is. So I could calculate 300 cubits meant that it was 450 feet long. That's pretty big for a boat, just the same. On the other hand, it's not that big if you want to fit in 2 of every living creature, including Noah and his wife and the other humans. Okay, so it was 50 cubits wide, approximately 75 feet, and 30 cubits high, which is another 45 feet. As you can see, it was really a floating box. There were no oars, nothing else.
A very impressive vessel indeed, twice as long as a Boeing 747. The naval technology required to build such a vessel was not acquired until the 19th century. And to complete a project this big, Noah would have needed the help of hundreds of workers, not the 4 men and their wives described in the story in the book of Genesis. Another problem was space. God asked Noah to gather 2 of each species of animal. How could Noah have gathered together species that he had never heard of? How could the ark have possibly been large enough to hold 25,000 species of birds, 15,000 species of mammals, 6,000 species of reptiles, 2,500 species of amphibians, and more than 1 million species of insects?
Now, what is to prevent a wise man with an eye to the future from thinking, in my grandfather's time, many people were killed. Those rivers are rising again. I am going to build a boat. Now, he doesn't have to be under the command of God to put 2 of everything or 7 of everything in the boat. He only has to look around at his own farm, at his own holdings, and thinks, well, if I take my family and myself and as many animals as we can get on board a large boat, eventually the flood will go down again, we can find a bit of dry land, and start again. So it might simply have been prudence rather than divine inspiration.
Chapter 7 of Genesis gives an idea of the magnitude of the disaster. Verse 11 says that the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
They thought it was the destruction of the entire world, but between you and I, the entire world meant the countries that they knew.
According to Genesis, the water covered everything on earth, rising more than 15 cubits or 8 meters above the mountains. That's a lot of water. Way too much. The volume of water that would have been required to cover the entire earth, including the highest mountains, would be the equivalent of double the size of our oceans. Where would it have come from, and where did it go? Since these questions are impossible to answer, should we conclude that the Great Flood was just a myth? Not exactly.
It wasn't a global flood, but rather a local flood. Somewhere between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, in Iran, a country that played a major role in the Bible. So, in theory, that is where the famous disaster took place. It was perceived as a global event, but in reality, it was actually quite regional in magnitude.
During archaeological digs in southern Iraq in the 1920s, scientists found alternating layers of limestone and sandy silt in the rock bed. They concluded that the area must have been the site of several periods of massive flooding.
Evidence for the flood story depends upon Mesopotamia and the two rivers. You have flat land, a floodplain between these two rivers. If something upsets the balance of the earth and the meteorology for a short while, that floodplain will be inundated. People will die.
Is it any wonder, then, that the oldest versions of the flood myth come from this very region?
There would have been flooding along the two major rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which have different sources. The Tigris comes from Armenia in the east, and the source of the Euphrates is in Syria. They almost join south of the Mesopotamia. And depending on the amount of snow that fell in any given year, together with seasonal rainfall, they could have easily experienced the occasional severe flooding. South of what is now Iraq was one of the largest Mesopotamian cities, the city of Ur. It is said that Abraham was from Ur of Chaldeans. The city was located near the junction of the Tigris and the Euphrates, a fact that was discovered by British Sir Leonard Woolley. At one point, he traced the region back to the 18th century before Jesus Christ and found nothing at all other than sand. He said, "This is odd. Since it was an important city, we should find traces back to the 3rd millennium, between 2000 and 3000 BC, and even earlier up to 4000 BC. So it was quite surprising. He went back to London and reflected on what he had found. Then he decided, I'm going to go back. Perhaps there was a flood of some sort. He began to dig, and sure enough, he discovered that there had been a huge flood around 2000 BC. He found close to 10 meters of clay deposits.
This flood, perhaps the most severe in its day, no doubt contributed to the myth of the Great Flood in the book of Genesis. But if these theories help to reduce the biblical flood to more realistic proportions, then why is there still such a strong desire to continue looking on snowbound Mount Ararat for the unlikely remains of Noah's Ark? Most expeditions carried out on Ararat have been arranged and financed by groups or individuals who are fundamentalists in their beliefs. To them, questioning the literal interpretation of the Bible is practically a crime against the Lord. The debate is much more a question of faith than one of science. The discovery of the remains of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat would prove the accuracy of the story told in Genesis and would be a striking victory for religion over science, two dogmas that are often irreconcilable. If it's fairly certain that Noah's Ark, if it ever did exist, can be found on top of Mount Ararat, then what are we to make of Durupinar's stone ark? Arriving at the Durupinar site, I was struck by how isolated it is. It is in the middle of nowhere, and only one small building on a ridge serving as both visitor center and museum identifies the spot. When I arrived, I was welcomed by Hassan Baba, an elderly gentleman from the neighboring village of Uzinjili. You might call him the custodian of the Ark. Since the 1960s, he has watched many adventurers come to explore and study this strange rocky formation. Durupinar's Ark lies in a geological depression. At first glance, it is easy to make out the shape of a boat. It is not surprising that in 1987, the government of Turkey designated this area as Noah's Ark National Park. This odd formation is located near the Armenian border, a few kilometers from the mythical Mount Ararat. The average altitude of the region is 1,900 meters above sea level, which is much lower than that of the tip of Mount Ararat, which stands at 5,165 meters. The size of the depression corresponds more or less to the size of the ark as described in the book of Genesis. Adding to the speculations, in the region of Akaila, a few kilometers from the Durupinar site, researchers found huge rocks that look curiously like the type of anchors that were once used by navigators.
The scientists, what I know is scientists, they have been research on anchor stones that they document it is anchor stone. They didn't finish their research yet. They have radar scans, they have all the materials, but still with this new technology, we need to have new research and like radar scans and, excavation, it needs to have. And now there is several companies and also the universities, they are collaborating together, and one of these companies, Anchorstone International, they are working on this place with different companies and the universities. They are trying to get a permit from the government to do this work.
Most of these rocks are now covered with crosses.
The anchor stones, it's true that there is a crosses on it. But I can say that in the same time, these stones are using as a tombstone. At the time that the Armenians was living in this area, and they, for example, they see well-done rocks and they use as a tombstone. If you think that, you could say that these people, the Christian, Orthodox, when they were living there, either they know that's the holy stones, they just replace it like this and carve crosses on it, or they didn't know and they see it's we use for the tombs, for the graves. And also, if you see the crosses on these stones, it's not usual cross of Armenian people they carve on the other cemeteries or the graveyard.
On many of these rocks, you can find eye holes that were believed to have been used to tie down the ship. Stone anchors in the middle of the desert, just a few kilometers away from Mount Ararat and Durupinar's Ark. Food for the imagination of adventurers seeking the lost Ark. If these really were stone anchors, could they have been used by the patriarch Noah to tie down his Ark? Mineral analyses have proven that these stones are made from a rock that is indigenous to the region of Ararat.
But it's completely different. I have been in lots of different graveyard that I try to find the same material. The tombstones are smaller and the crosses are completely different. And I look all area that I say, maybe we could find the rock with the hole like this. We didn't. And this is only the example, in this village, this is only the example in the world you can see.
As for Durupinar's Ark, rock samplings carried out in 1987 and 88 have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the shape is not a 2,000-year-old petrified boat, but rather an unusual geological formation, the likes of which can be found elsewhere in the region. A freak of nature no doubt created by a major mudslide along the steep ravines.
If you and I were exploring around the edge of that plateau, we would find that there were some very curious salt rock formations, which an imaginative witness could see as a human being. There are all kinds of stone circles throughout Britain and Europe, and the legends attached to them Some are called the hunters because they dared to go hunting on the Sabbath, and God promptly turned them into a ring of stone, so that when we find an unusual rock formation that looked vaguely as it might have been the traditional shape of Noah's Ark, then we're inclined to say, oh yes, that's the Ark. But God, in his wisdom, turned it to stone to preserve it for us to see and believe.
For historians and archaeologists, the story of Noah and his ark is nothing more than an allegory, combining oral tradition, religion, and historical fact.
If we stick strictly to written accounts of the human history, then 3/4 of the time, there has been nothing to say, or practically nothing. Physical remains of history have told us the rest of the story. So knowing how to read information from an archaeological cup, knowing how to read into ceramics, knowing how to read into architecture, whether it be domestic, civil, racial, or other, is our way, for the most part, of reconstructing the history of those eras.
The search for the remains of Noah's Ark is much more than just a crazy idea held by adventurers.
It's beyond my theology to envisage a God whom Jesus describes as a God of love, who is then going to say in an arbitrary fashion, I'm tired of these people and all their sins, I'm going to drown them. It's not the God I worship who would have done or said that.
For the average man, the search for the Ark is an epic, worthy of the adventures of Indiana Jones, a search where heroes and villains get lost between myth and reality.
What's beautiful, of course, in the story of the Ark is when the rainbow appears. Rainbows have always been a symbol of calmness, peace, prosperity, and things like that, which return after a storm or a crisis, something along those lines. So this arc in the sky symbolizes that there will not be another bout of torrential rain strong enough to wipe humanity off the face of the earth.
An adventure where the entertainment value and the dream are more important than the truth. As Russian writer Alexander Pushkin once said, I would prefer to hear an exciting lie rather than the sad and boring truth. Although this quote has never solved any mysteries, it has given us insight into many of them.